Hi everyone, this is the first lecture for POL102. Today the lecture is on Chapter 1, and we're just going to be going over a few important questions at the outset to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about as the semester goes on, and we'll also cover a few really key principles of the American political system. Specifically, we're going to start out sort of going over what the purpose of a government is, which is a pretty important question to answer for any class that's talking about government. And second, we're going to get into a little bit of what the key foundational aspects of our system are, talk about a bit of a comparison between our system and those of a few other countries. We'll talk about that briefly. And then finally, we'll close out speaking to some core aspects of our political culture and how people identify themselves within it. Alright, so as I said, the first thing we're going to be talking about today is what is the purpose of government. This is maybe an obvious question for some, but it's worth talking about before we get into to all the other things we're going to be talking about with regards to government in this semester. So first of all, let's define government. Government is generally referring to a set of institutions that have usually a monopoly on force throughout a particular geographic area, which is used to create and enforce policies within that territory. In other words, this means that government often can and must force citizens to do things they otherwise wouldn't want to do. So a question arising from this is, why do citizens agree to this? Why do they want to have government at all when one way to look at it is that government restricts their freedom to some extent? We'll talk about three particular reasons, among others that exist, as to why this is the case. The first of which will be theoretical in nature, the social contract, and then we'll get into a few other more concrete practical reasons of why people want government and what it can do for them. Alright, so first of all, let's think about what would things be like in the absence of a government. Usually we refer to this state as anarchy, and this isn't usually something that's considered a good thing, right? We want some degree of order in society. It's necessary for any sort of industry to arise, for people to go about and seek fulfillment in their lives. So you generally want something in place to prevent anarchy from arising. One way that this statement I've just said has been conceptualized is through the social contract, which is a sort of philosophical theory whereby people generally are recognizing what I just said is true, that we want order, we don't want chaos. And so the social contract represents basically the people implicitly vesting some of their freedom into a sovereign or government that is there to prevent anarchy from arising and to impose order. Probably the most famous statement of this principle of the social contract that I'm talking about right now is through this treatise here by Hobbes, Leviathan. Anyone who's either familiar with or taking a course on political philosophy, this is one of the first texts you'll probably read. And in it, he conceptualizes the social contract sort of as coming out to prevent the state that he refers to as the war of all against all, whereby if we don't get together and invest some portion of our freedom in this sovereign, we'll have this state where everyone's just constantly in competition with one another. Typically it'll be violent competition where people are trying to take resources from other people. When this is the case, like I said, you don't really have the opportunity to do anything with your life other than defend your resources and try to take them from other people. And one other thing to mention as far as the social contract goes, like I said, this is mostly theoretical in nature. No one really ever goes around before government is formed and says, here's a social contract, will everyone sign up for it? This is basically just a way that political philosophers have justified the presence of government and why why people in general will accept some degree of restriction on what they can do in order to get order out of potential chaos. Getting into a few practical reasons for why we have government and why people accept it. One is the provision of public goods and services. First of all, let's define what public goods are. This is maybe a term that you've heard before, but maybe aren't familiar as much with what the academic definition is, so let's get into it. So public goods are defined by two different traits, non-rivalry and non-excludability. When we talk about non-rivalrous, this means that if one person is consuming the good, it doesn't prevent someone else from consuming it. So you can think of any number of goods or services that fulfill this criterion. A water fountain, for instance. If I'm drinking from the water fountain, it's still going to be there for you to drink from. Afterward, maybe it's rivalrous at the exact moment that I'm drinking from it, but not in a general sense. When I'm consuming the water there, there's still water left for people afterward. Non-excludability, sort of similar in nature. Non-excludability means that there's no real ability for the people who own or provide the good to prevent people from consuming it if they don't want them to. Usually, you think about people creating goods or services so that they can sell them to people in order to make money. This is usually, this is pretty much the impetus beyond all the production in our economy. Non-excludability means that this is a good where you can't prevent people from consuming it if you're providing it in general. This is obviously a big issue for the provision of these types of goods because there's not really any incentive for people to provide them if they don't have any means of actually gaining compensation for it. You don't really want to provide the park or the clean air or whatever if you don't have any chance of getting any compensation in return for it. So this is really the crux behind why government is so important for the provision of public goods. These are generally goods that private actors aren't going to be willing or able to provide because they don't stand to make any sort of profit off of them. There's just no real incentive other than if someone's that nice that they just want to spend their own money and resources to provide these. There's not really any real payout for those that do so. So let's talk a little bit more. Here's another a classic example, I guess, of public goods, national defense. So it's non-rivalrous in that if it's being provided, if I'm enjoying national defense, it doesn't prevent anyone else from also being defended by the provision of it. It's non-excludable in that you can't really say, I'm only going to provide defense for people who pay me money for doing so, and everyone else, they're not defended. It's really, you can't imagine any arrangement that would allow that to happen. It just doesn't make logical sense. So this is a good defense that you would imagine wouldn't be provided, just by private actors. We could have a country, maybe it's not going to be properly defended without someone with the ability to take money forcibly from people and apply it to the provisions of national defense. So, what I'm describing there is just a system of taxation and appropriations for these defense items that we use to defend our country. So national defense is a public good. As a matter of fact, the largest expenditure public good that our government provides. Here's another example that will probably hit closer to home as we go throughout the semester in the winter. When there's a snowstorm, the clearing of the roads is a public good. It's non-rivalrous in that, at least up to a certain extent, if someone is driving on the road, it's not interfering with my ability to drive on the road as well. Obviously, if you get up into huge numbers of cars on the road where there's too much traffic, that can come into play, but in general, roads aren't rivalrous. It's not excludable in that there's not really that much of an ability. I mean, you can imagine there's some roads have tolls, but in a general sense, surface roads would be really difficult to exclude people from driving on who didn't pay to use it. So this is another example of a public good. Usually the clearing of the roads is provisioned by the government. They'll be the ones paying for it. Oftentimes they'll contract out to private groups, but the government is ultimately the one providing the payment and the good itself. A corresponding example of a private good would be like if it snows and you've got to go out and shovel your own walkways or your own driveway. So here, This person, when he gets done shoveling the sidewalk, if he wanted to, he could exclude people from coming onto his walkway. It's his property. He could just say, no, you aren't allowed here. So, your personal shoveling, private, the shoveling and clearing of public spaces is a public good. All right, beyond public good provisions, another practical reason that people would like to have government is dispute resolution. So, getting back to Leviathan and the state of war, of all against all, if in the state of anarchy, most disputes would either not be settled or they'd be settled by violence, and this is inefficient. This doesn't really allow for the development of any sort of strong, far-reaching society. So, another purpose of government is to set up, what's allowed and what's not allowed in society, and determine, when someone does transgress against someone else, what are the penalties, what's the punishment for the person that transgresses, what is the compensation owed to the person who's transgressed against. So this is another really important role of government, establishing, usually through a criminal code and a civil code, what is allowed, and when people come into conflict or violate these things, what is the appropriate action that gets put into place. Generally, when you have a strong government, a functioning government, I should say, within an area, most disputes aren't breaking down into violence. They're handled in some way that's been determined beforehand. All right, so this discussion so far, we focused on some general questions of why we might want government. Hopefully, most of you at this point are fairly convinced of the value of having a government. Let's talk now about what some specific, really foundational principles of the American form of government are. We could talk about how this compared to other places throughout the world, and then we'll close out talking a little bit about some defining aspects of political culture. And it's worth mentioning that at the outset here, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about in this section are going to be detailed a lot more as we go into the subsequent lectures that talk about these things in particular. All right, first of all, let's identify some things that really define the American political system. Political equality is one of them. So, adult Americans generally all have the right to vote. There's a few exceptions to this. For instance, felons in some states are disenfranchised as a result of their crimes. But for the most part, all adult Americans at this point can vote. Obviously this wasn't the case throughout the history of the country, but we have mostly universal suffrage at this point. And each vote generally counts equally as well. So, one person, one vote. I have this caveat here for the most part. We have like the Electoral College and presidential elections, which if you look at how much each vote counts in each state, the states with really small populations, as a ratio of the electoral votes that they get to the number of people in the state, it's greater for the smaller states, like if you're in a Wyoming or a Dakota, north or south, something like that, than if you're in a California, Texas, or New York. But this is only one particular aspect of the system that's defined that way, like in state elections involving like Senate, House, something like that, or even in general at the state level for presidential elections, one person gets one vote, and each vote counts equally. Likewise, all Americans are free to participate in politics, at whichever level they wish, federal level, state level, local level, wherever they want to put their effort. I get a note here that there are some exceptions to this. Notably, some people don't have the requisite resources to participate in politics, so maybe they don't have enough money or time to participate how they'd like. Some people don't have the requisite knowledge, so maybe they just aren't informed enough about the political system to determine how to best express themselves within it. But everyone does have the freedom to participate at whatever level they wish. Likewise, in addition to political equality, we have equality before the law. We just talked about how having a system of resolving disputes is one reason to have a government in the first place. And our dispute resolution system is defined by equality for everyone within the system. So, one person, if they do something wrong, they violate the civil or legal code, they're treated the same as any other person in society. I would say, again, this is something of an idealistic statement. This is, in general, I'd say mostly true, but we can all think of specific cases in which certain people or groups are treated either less or more favorably than others under our system. This isn't really the venue to discuss that yet. We're just outlining some basic principles of the system. For the most part, the law handles people roughly the same as anyone else. And finally, the last thing to talk about on this topic, our system is generally defined by plurality rule. Plurality, just to define, whoever gets the most votes, they have a plurality. A majority would be greater than 50%, but usually most of our elections are determined just by whoever has the most amount of votes, whether they have a majority or not. One notable exception, I just talked about the Electoral College a second ago. The Electoral College, the actual electoral votes, you require a majority to win the presidency, and if no one obtains a majority, we have a system, other contingencies in place for Congress to decide the presidency. But in most elections, it's plurality that matters. So for Senate, Congress, most state governorships, most of them are determined just by plurality as far as who gets the most votes. Even within states, talk about presidential elections. The ultimate selection is up to the Electoral College, but within states, the presidential vote is usually determined in a pluralistic fashion. So you don't necessarily need to get greater than 50% to gain a certain state's electoral votes. You just need more than anyone else on the ballot. So what's really important here is that we have a pluralistic system in which whoever gets the most votes wins power. The good thing about our system, though, is that those that are in the minority, not necessarily speaking in terms of ethnic, racial, or whatever, but just those who lose, those who aren't in the plurality of selecting the leaders in the country, they're protected from having their rights usurped by those who do win. So the Republicans just won the White House. They maintain control of Congress, so they have unified government going forward for at least the next couple of years. What they won't be allowed to do with that is just to take that power and vote the Democratic Party out of existence, for example. There are safeguards in place that prevent that from happening, different checks in our system. So just by virtue of winning, you don't have the right to eliminate the rights of those who aren't in the plurality. Okay, and these things that we've talked about, like I said, are just really broad principles that are important to know. We'll have a lot more to say about various aspects of our political system going forward, of course. That's the entire subject matter of the course. It's worth noting just quickly at this point that America isn't necessarily the only model, of course. Even within democracies, there's a high degree of variance in the way the institutions are arranged. So not all democracies have a constitution, for example. The next lecture will be about the American Constitution, but not every democracy has one single foundational document that outlines its political system. We do, for the most part. Everything about how our government is going to run, at least a lot of it is found in the Constitution. Next, not all democracies are federal in nature. This is another topic that we're going to get into extensively in subsequent lectures. I think it's the one after the Constitution, so 2 from now. When we talk about federalism, this is just a system where sovereignty is shared between different levels of government, so states and the federal government, the national government, in other words, in our system, both have shared sovereignty, and one cannot eliminate the other. Both have their own power reserved to each other. In some places, though, this isn't the case. In Britain, for example, it's you just have a national government, and that's where most of the power is held. Or state governments within the United States are a good example. So the state of New York is non-federal in nature. They have reign to determine what municipalities, how they're defined, what powers they have. The key point of federalism is just that the states within our country have certain powers that the federal government can't take away. And finally, I've talked a little bit about presidential elections. So obviously we have a presidential system in the United States. This isn't the case. It's probably actually less frequently the case in democracies than other systems. The presidential system just means that the chief executive, usually called the president, obviously in presidential systems, is selected separately from the legislature. So in a parliamentary system, on the other hand, people vote for people to go into parliament, and be members of parliament representing districts or whatever the unit is. And then parliament in that system would be going on to select the chief executive. Presidential systems, like I just said, the two are selected differently, so you can have situations where I just mentioned, for going forward, we'll have unified government under the Republican Party. For the last few years, going back to 2011, actually, we've had different parts of the government controlled by different parties. So Congress was controlled by the Republicans, at least portions of it, and the presidency was controlled by the Democrats. This is a feature of our system, a presidential system, that allows for separate selection of leaders from one party for one branch of government, and then from some other party for another branch. The final thing I'd like to talk about today is just a little bit about the culture that people act in our system. The way people think about themselves within the political system. So how do they identify? How do they think of themselves? And let's talk about two separate aspects of one's political identity. First being party identification, and then we'll talk about ideology. To start with party identification, I just talked about Democrats and Republicans, and I'm sure pretty much everyone listening to this is aware of the two major parties before listening to this lecture. Party identification is a term that's used to talk about how attached someone is to one party or another. So, a psychological phenomenon, affinity, favorability, however you want to express it, towards one or the other parties. So, some people won't have any party identification. A lot of people, actually the modal category these days is people who identify as independent, so they don't have strong favorability or affinity toward either party. On the other hand, you could have certain people, identify strongly as a Republican, strongly as a Democrat, moderately as either, slightly as either. So when we talk about party identification, think a psychological phenomenon. This is a distinct concept from party registration, which is another often discussed way to talk about partisanship. Registration, you're talking about officially being registered in a state. So a lot of states, when you go to register to vote, you can select whether you want to register as a Democrat or Republican, some other party or no party. Usually the more interesting and the more consequential concept to talk about is identification, though. It's just, there's a high degree of correspondence between identification and registration, of course. It's just that identification usually tells you more about the person and how they're thinking at a given moment. Next, we talked about just a little bit about party identification. Ideology deals less with partisanship and more to do with affinity towards particular policies. So one way this can be expressed, and this is taken from the book, is this chart here, where ideology is depicted as sort of bi-dimensional, where on one dimension we have economic policy, social policy on the other dimension, and the way this is expressed in the book is in terms of government intervention into these different domains. And roughly speaking, I think I like these categorizations. I think they make sense to a large degree. So conservatives, to some extent, want intervention on social issues, less so in the economy. Liberals, just the opposite. They desire intervention in the economy to some degree, less intervention in terms of social issues. Libertarians, this is a term I'm sure a lot are familiar with. These would be people who just don't want intervention in either dimension, either in the economy or into people's personal lives. And then populism out here. This is one label I'm less keen on, the way the book puts it, just because there are a lot of different definitions throughout history of what populism constituted. In this case, they have populism corresponding to people who want intervention in both the economy and the social issues, and that's certainly one form of populism, but not necessarily the only one. So I'd just be careful when you hear that term, just to not necessarily think of the way it's depicted here. But in general, this is you can break political ideology down into a number of other dimensions. This is just the most commonly used one, and just try to be aware of what these various labels are and what they correspond to on each dimension, the economy and social issues. Finally, whenever we talk about ideology, I think it's also important to note that there's a large portion of the country that is not ideological in any of the ways we're discussing here. In other words, these would be people who either are ambiguous on policies, such that they have they have various different social positions and economic positions that don't necessarily correspond in one particular direction, either left or right. You also have a large portion of Americans that simply don't think enough about policy to develop really well crystallized opinions, so they're not ideological in that respect. They just don't have these positions. So it's important, when conversing about political culture and the American system, to know, the broad labels for ideology and what they entail. Also, equally important to note that for a large number of people in the country, none of these labels are really going to accurately depict where they are. Alright, so that is the end for this lecture. Like I said, it's a relatively short one, and I'll see you next time.